The morning mist clung to the shell-torn landscape like the breath of ghosts, and in the pre-dawn darkness of September 26, 1918, nearly 500,000 American soldiers crouched in their trenches, waiting for the signal that would launch them into hell. General John Joseph Pershing stood at his command post, watching the hands of his pocket watch creep toward 5:30 in the morning. In a few moments, he would unleash the largest offensive in American military history, an assault that would either break the German war machine or break his own army in the attempt. The Argonne forest stretched before them like a primeval nightmare, its ancient oak and beech trees shattered by 4 years of artillery bombardment. German machine gun nests lurked behind every fallen trunk, and miles of barbed wire snaked through the undergrowth like steel thorns. This was no ordinary battlefield. This was terrain that German military engineers had spent 4 years fortifying into an impregnable fortress. Every ridge, every ravine, every cluster of trees had been transformed into a killing field. Pershing had fought tooth and nail with the Allied High Command to keep his American Expeditionary Force together as an independent army rather than feeding his divisions piecemeal into British and French units. Now, as he prepared to commit over 1.2 million Americans to this massive assault, the weight of that decision pressed upon his shoulders like a mountain. According to the American Battle Monuments Commission, this would be one of America's most significant battles in terms of men and equipment engaged, the numbers of dead and wounded, and the strategic consequences. The objective was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. The Americans would drive north through the Argonne forest and the heights overlooking the Meuse River, advancing 24 miles to capture the vital German railroad hub at Sedan. If successful, this would sever the primary supply line, keeping the German armies in France and Belgium alive. If it failed, American losses would be catastrophic and the war might drag on for another year. At exactly 5:30, the earth erupted in flame and thunder. Nearly 3,000 American artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, hurling over 200,000 shells into the German positions in a 3-hour bombardment that could be heard in Paris. The preliminary bombardment included 800 mustard gas and phosgene shells that killed 278 German soldiers before the ground assault even began. As documented by History.com, the ground shook so violently that soldiers 30 miles away felt the tremors beneath their feet. When the barrage lifted, 9 American divisions rose from their trenches like a khaki tide and began their advance across no man's land. The 1st Division, veterans of countless battles, moved forward with grim determination. The 77th Division, composed largely of city boys from New York who had never seen a forest before the war, stumbled through the nightmare landscape of the Argonne. The 4th Division advanced along the Meuse River, while the 35th and 91st Divisions pushed toward the center of the German line. The initial assault caught the German defenders by surprise. Many were young conscripts and older reservists, a far cry from the elite stormtroopers who had spearheaded Germany's spring offensive. Some positions fell within hours, and by evening, American troops had advanced several miles along most of the front. But Pershing and his staff knew that the real test was yet to come. The Germans had built their defensive positions in depth, with multiple lines of trenches, machine gun nests, and artillery positions stretching back for miles. As night fell, on that first day, the American Medical Corps was already overwhelmed with casualties. Field hospitals struggled to cope with thousands of wounded soldiers, many suffering from the effects of poison gas or shrapnel wounds. The reality of what lay ahead was becoming clear. This would not be a quick breakthrough, but a grinding battle of attrition that would test the American army to its very limits. The fight that would ultimately push Germany to seek an armistice had begun with thunder and lightning, but it would be won or lost in the mud and blood of the days to come. By the 3rd day of the offensive, the initial optimism had given way to grim reality. The American advance had slowed to a crawl as German resistance stiffened, and the terrain itself became as deadly an enemy as the soldiers firing from hidden positions. The Argonne forest had been transformed into a hellscape that defied description. Trees, stripped of bark and leaves by artillery fire, stood like skeletal sentinels over a landscape pocked with shell craters and carpeted with the debris of war. Major General Robert Lee Bullard's Third Corps found itself grinding forward through some of the most difficult terrain on the Western Front. The ravines and ridges that characterized this region created perfect defensive positions for the German machine gunners. Every advance had to be measured in yards rather than miles, and each yard cost American lives. The 77th Division, in particular, faced nightmarish conditions as they pushed deeper into the forest, where map references became meaningless, and units lost contact with their commanders. The German defensive strategy was as methodical as it was deadly. Crown Prince Wilhelm's army group, commanded by General Max von Gallwitz, had prepared multiple defensive lines: the Hindenburg Line, the Kriemhilde Stellung, and several intermediate positions. Each position was anchored by concrete bunkers housing machine guns with interlocking fields of fire. When one position became untenable, the Germans would fall back to the next prepared line, making the Americans pay for every foot of ground. On September 28th, the American advance came to a virtual halt along most of the front. The inexperience of many American units began to show as coordination broke down and units became separated in the dense forest. Communication lines were constantly cut by artillery fire, leaving battalion and company commanders to make critical decisions without knowing the larger situation. Some units advanced too quickly and found themselves surrounded, while others became bogged down by fierce resistance at relatively minor strongpoints. The logistics of supplying such a massive force over terrible roads added another layer of complexity to the operation. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, and reinforcements had to be moved forward over shell-torn terrain under constant artillery bombardment. The famous Red Ball Express Highway became clogged with supply trucks, ambulances, and reinforcements, all trying to move simultaneously. Traffic jams stretched for miles, and critical supplies often failed to reach the front lines when needed most. By the end of September, it became clear that the initial plan had been overly optimistic. General Pershing made the difficult decision to pause the offensive on September 30th to reorganize his forces and bring up fresh divisions. The casualties from the first 4 days were staggering. Over 15,000 Americans had been killed or wounded, and many units were at less than half strength. The Army Heritage Center Foundation notes that American casualties were high, over 117,000. But the results were impressive as the First Army had driven 43 German divisions back about 30 miles. The German High Command watched the American offensive with growing concern. While their forces had held, the sheer weight of the American assault was taking its toll. German casualties were mounting, and reserves were being committed at an alarming rate. More troubling from the German perspective was the clear indication that the Americans were willing to continue attacking regardless of losses. This was not the war-weary ally that German intelligence had expected, but a fresh and determined enemy with seemingly unlimited reserves. The pause in the offensive also revealed the true human cost of the campaign thus far. Field hospitals were overwhelmed with wounded soldiers, and the sight of ambulances streaming back from the front lines became a constant reminder of the price being paid. Yet morale among the American troops remained surprisingly high. They had seen German resistance weaken in many sectors, and prisoners reported that German morale was cracking under the relentless pressure of the American assault. As October began, both sides prepared for the next phase of what was becoming the decisive battle of the war. The Americans used the brief respite to reorganize their forces, bring up fresh ammunition, and replace their most badly mauled units. The Germans rushed reinforcements from other sectors of the Western Front, knowing that if the American offensive succeeded in breaking through, the war would be over. The stage was set for an even more desperate and bloody continuation of the battle that would determine the fate of nations. When the American offensive resumed on October 4th, it carried with it a different character than the initial assault. The men who climbed out of their trenches that morning were veterans now, hardened by their first taste of the Argonne's horrors. They moved with the grim efficiency of soldiers who had learned that survival depended on speed, aggression, and an intimate knowledge of the enemy's methods. The artillery preparation was shorter but more concentrated, targeting specific strong points identified during the previous phase of fighting. The second phase of the Meuse-Argonne offensive revealed both the growing competence of American forces and the increasing desperation of German resistance. Units that had stumbled through the forest 2 weeks earlier now moved with purpose, using small unit tactics learned through bitter experience. The 28th Division, composed primarily of Pennsylvania National Guardsmen, demonstrated particular skill in reducing German machine gun positions through coordinated infantry-artillery cooperation. Major Charles White Whittlesey's 1st Battalion of the 307th Infantry found themselves in a situation that would become legendary in American military history, pushing forward through the Argonne forest faster than the units on their flanks. They became completely surrounded by German forces in what became known as the Lost Battalion Incident. For 5 days, these 550 men held their position against overwhelming odds, surviving on rainwater and the few emergency rations they carried, while German forces pounded their perimeter with artillery, machine gun fire, and even flamethrowers. The rescue of the Lost Battalion became a symbol of American determination and tactical evolution. Rather than launching frontal assaults that had characterized the earlier fighting, American commanders coordinated complex operations involving multiple divisions. The 77th Division attacked from the south, while the 28th Division struck from the west, gradually compressing the German positions until relief forces could reach Whittlesey's surrounded men. Only 194 of the original 550 men were still able to fight when relief arrived. Meanwhile, along the Meuse River, American forces faced different but equally daunting challenges. The German artillery positioned on the eastern bank of the river could fire directly into the flanks of advancing American units, making movement during daylight extremely hazardous. The 5th Corps, under Major General Charles Pilot Summerall, developed night movement techniques that allowed them to advance under cover of darkness and dig in before dawn. These tactics proved so effective that they were quickly adopted by other units along the front. The German response to the renewed American offensive revealed the increasing strain on their forces. Reserve divisions that had been pulled from other sectors of the Western Front were often understrength and composed largely of teenagers and middle-aged reservists. The elite divisions that had formed the backbone of German resistance were being ground down by the relentless American attacks. Captured German documents revealed that some regiments were at less than 20% of their authorized strength. By mid-October, the cumulative effect of the American offensive was becoming apparent to the German High Command. General Erich Ludendorff, the architect of Germany's military strategy, began pressing for peace negotiations. The loss of the railroad junction at Grand Pré on October 10th was particularly significant, as it forced the Germans to rely on increasingly tenuous supply lines to support their forces in France and Belgium. The strategic objective that Pershing had identified months earlier was finally within reach. The fighting during this phase also saw the emergence of American tactical innovations that would influence military doctrine for decades to come. Combined arms operations, involving close coordination between infantry, artillery, and the limited number of tanks available, proved particularly effective against German defensive positions. The American forces had evolved from enthusiastic but inexperienced troops into a formidable military machine capable of sustained offensive operations against determined opposition. As October progressed, intelligence reports from German prisoners painted an increasingly grim picture of enemy morale. Units that had fought with fanatical determination earlier in the war were now surrendering in growing numbers. The Spanish influenza epidemic that was sweeping through both armies hit the malnourished German forces particularly hard, further weakening their ability to resist. The combination of military pressure and internal collapse was beginning to crack the foundation of German resistance, setting the stage for the final dramatic phase of the offensive. The final phase of the Meuse-Argonne offensive began on November 1st, 1918, with an intensity that surprised even veteran American commanders. Every lesson learned during the previous 5 weeks of fighting had been incorporated into this ultimate assault. The artillery preparation was precisely targeted based on aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogations. Infantry units moved in smaller, more flexible formations that could adapt quickly to changing circumstances on the battlefield. General Pershing had reorganized his forces for this climactic push, bringing up the experienced Second Army under Lieutenant General Robert Lee Bullard while concentrating his most battle-tested divisions for the assault. The 1st Division, the Big Red One, spearheaded the attack through the Argonne forest with a ferocity that broke German resistance in sectors that had held firm for weeks. The 2nd Division advanced along the Meuse River, systematically reducing German strongpoints that had dominated the battlefield since the offensive began. The transformation in American fighting capability was remarkable. Units that had taken heavy casualties trying to advance a few hundred yards in September were now breaking through German defensive lines and advancing several miles in a single day. The 42nd Division, the Rainbow Division, composed of National Guard units from across the United States, exemplified this evolution as they captured the strategic heights of Côte de Châtillon in a perfectly executed combined arms assault. The German response to this renewed assault revealed the true extent of their deteriorating situation. Many positions that had been defended to the last man in October were now abandoned after token resistance. Prisoners reported widespread hunger, lack of ammunition, and most critically, a collapse in morale that made sustained resistance increasingly impossible. The famous German discipline that had held their forces together through 4 years of warfare was finally cracking under the relentless pressure of American attacks. By November 4th, American forces had achieved breakthrough along most of the front. The First Army had advanced to within striking distance of Sedan, the railroad hub whose capture would effectively end Germany's ability to supply their forces in France and Belgium. The psychological impact of this achievement was as important as its strategic value. After 4 years of static trench warfare, American forces had accomplished what British and French armies had been unable to achieve despite numerous costly offensives. The capture of the Kriemhilde Stellung, the last major German defensive line in the sector, on November 6th, marked the effective end of organized German resistance in the Argonne. American units that had struggled for weeks to advance a few hundred yards were now moving so rapidly that supply lines could barely keep pace. The contrast with the grinding warfare of the previous month was stark. What had been a battle of attrition had suddenly become a war of movement. Intelligence reports from this period reveal the true scope of German collapse. Entire divisions were reporting that they could no longer maintain cohesive defense lines. The Army Heritage Center Foundation documents that the First Army had driven 43 German divisions back about 30 miles over some of the most difficult terrain and most heavily fortified positions on the Western Front, while inflicting over 120,000 casualties. The German command structure was breaking down as communications failed and unit commanders lost contact with their higher headquarters. The Spanish influenza epidemic, which had been a background concern throughout the offensive, now became a critical factor in German collapse. Weakened by months of poor nutrition and the stress of constant combat, German forces were decimated by the disease. Some German units reported that more men were incapacitated by influenza than by American attacks. This biological warfare, fought by an invisible enemy, was as decisive as any tactical innovation in bringing about German defeat. On November 7th, American patrols reached the outskirts of Sedan itself, the symbolic and strategic objective that had driven the entire offensive. The sight of American soldiers, overlooking the railroad yards that had supplied German armies for 4 years of warfare, was a powerful symbol of impending victory. As night fell on November 7th, both armies knew that the war was entering its final hours, and the great gamble that Pershing had taken in launching the Meuse-Argonne offensive had achieved its ultimate purpose. The final days of the Meuse-Argonne offensive unfolded with the desperate urgency of men racing against time itself. As American forces closed on Sedan and German resistance crumbled along the entire front, both sides understood that hours, not days, would determine the war's conclusion. On November 8th, reports reached General Pershing's headquarters that German emissaries had crossed the lines under a flag of truce, seeking terms for an armistice. The great offensive that had begun with such uncertainty 7 weeks earlier was on the verge of achieving its ultimate strategic objective. Yet, the fighting continued with undiminished ferocity even as diplomats negotiated the terms of Germany's surrender. German rearguard actions, though increasingly desperate, still extracted a terrible price from advancing American forces. The Meuse River crossings became scenes of particular carnage as American engineers struggled to build bridges under artillery, fire from German positions on the eastern bank. The 89th Division suffered heavy casualties in the final week of fighting, losing men to achieve objectives that would become meaningless within days of their capture. The irony of warfare was never more apparent than during these final days. Soldiers continued to die for ground that would be evacuated by German forces regardless of military action, as the armistice negotiations had already determined the broad outline of German withdrawal from occupied territory. Yet neither side could afford to appear weak in these final negotiations, and the fighting continued with grim determination on both sides. The National Archives documents that it was also the deadliest campaign in American history, resulting in over 26,000 soldiers being killed in action and over 120,000 total casualties. American casualties during the final phase were particularly tragic given the proximity of peace. The 78th Division lost over 400 men in the last week of fighting, including many killed on November 10th, just hours before the armistice would take effect. These losses were made more poignant by the knowledge that families at home were already celebrating premature reports of peace, unaware that their sons and husbands were still dying in the forests of France. The German army's disintegration accelerated dramatically during the first week of November. Entire regiments simply abandoned their positions and began walking toward Germany, no longer willing to die for a cause that their leaders had already acknowledged as lost. American forces advancing through abandoned German positions found evidence of hasty evacuation, equipment scattered along roads, supply dumps left intact, and defensive positions that could have held for weeks abandoned without a fight. The Spanish influenza pandemic reached its crescendo during these final days, affecting both armies but striking the malnourished German forces with particular severity. American field hospitals, already overwhelmed with battle casualties, now faced the additional burden of treating thousands of influenza victims. The disease showed no respect for military rank or nationality, killing generals and privates, Americans and Germans, with equal efficiency. In some sectors, more men were incapacitated by influenza than by enemy action. On November 10th, American artillery units received preliminary orders to cease firing at 11 o'clock the following morning. After 47 days of continuous bombardment, the guns that had hurled millions of shells into German positions would finally fall silent. Artillery commanders used their remaining hours to expend stockpiled ammunition rather than transport it back to supply depots, creating a final crescendo of destruction that echoed across the battlefield throughout the night of November 10th. The last American soldier to die in the Meuse-Argonne offensive was Private Henry Nicholas Gunther of the 313th Infantry Regiment, killed at 10:59 on November 11, 1918, just 1 minute before the Armistice took effect. His death symbolized both the terrible waste of war and the dedication of American soldiers who had fought with such determination in the forests and fields of eastern France. The offensive that had begun with such enormous ambitions had achieved its strategic objectives, but at a cost that would haunt American military planners for generations to come. As November 11, 1918, dawned cold and gray over the Argonne forest, both armies prepared for the strangest moment in the history of warfare, the precisely timed end of humanity's most devastating conflict. At exactly 11 o'clock in the morning, the guns would fall silent, and the great offensive that had broken Germany's will to continue fighting would finally come to an end. At precisely 11 o'clock on the morning of November 11th, 1918, an unnatural silence descended upon the battlefield that had echoed with the thunder of artillery for 47 consecutive days. American soldiers, many of whom had known nothing but the constant roar of gunfire for weeks, found the sudden quiet more unsettling than the bombardments they had endured. In that moment of silence, the Meuse-Argonne offensive officially ended, and with it, the great war that had consumed a generation of young men. The immediate aftermath of the Armistice revealed the true scope of American achievement in the offensive. Over 1.2 million American soldiers had participated in the campaign, making it the largest military operation in United States history up to that point. The territorial gains were impressive. American forces had advanced over 30 miles through some of the most heavily fortified terrain on the Western Front, capturing vital strategic objectives and shattering the German defensive system that had held Allied forces at bay for 4 years. But statistics could not capture the human dimension of what had been accomplished. In field hospitals scattered across the battle zone, doctors and nurses continued their desperate work to save wounded soldiers who had fallen in the war's final minutes. The Romaine-American Military Cemetery, established in the heart of the former battlefield, would eventually hold the remains of over 14,000 American soldiers, more than at the more famous cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach in Normandy. These silent rows of white crosses testified to the price paid for victory in what historians would remember as America's bloodiest battle. The German perspective on the offensive's conclusion revealed the strategic success of Pershing's vision. General Erich Ludendorff, in his post-war memoirs, acknowledged that the American breakthrough at Sedan would have been catastrophic for German forces throughout France and Belgium. The railroad hub that had been the offensive's primary objective was indeed the lifeline that kept German armies supplied. Its imminent capture, combined with successful British and French offensives along other sectors of the Western Front, left Germany with no alternative but to seek an immediate armistice. The transformation of American military capability during the course of the offensive was perhaps its most significant long-term consequence. The inexperienced divisions that had stumbled through the Argonne forest in September had evolved into a formidable military machine capable of breakthrough operations against determined opposition. American tactical innovations, particularly in the coordination of infantry, artillery, and air power, would influence military doctrine for decades to come and establish the United States as a major military power on the world stage. The immediate celebration of Armistice was tempered by the sobering realization of what the victory had cost. The Army Heritage Center Foundation notes that American casualties were high, over 117,000, including 26,277 killed in action. These losses were concentrated in the span of just 47 days, making the Meuse-Argonne offensive one of the most intensive periods of combat in American military history. Entire communities back home would be devastated by casualty reports that continued to arrive for days after the fighting had ended. General Pershing's insistence on maintaining American forces as an independent army, rather than integrating them into British and French units, was vindicated by the offensive's success. The American Expeditionary Force had proven capable of planning and executing large-scale offensive operations independently of its allies. This demonstration of military competence established the United States as an equal partner in the Allied victory and ensured American participation in the post-war settlement as a major power rather than a junior partner. The Spanish influenza pandemic, which had ravaged both armies throughout the offensive, continued its deadly work even after the guns fell silent. The massive movement of troops during demobilization helped spread the disease across continents, ultimately killing more people than the war itself. In many ways, this biological catastrophe overshadowed the military victory, as families who had survived 4 years of warfare found themselves mourning loved ones killed by an invisible enemy that recognized no armistice. The end of fighting also revealed the environmental devastation that modern warfare had inflicted upon the landscape. The Argonne forest, once a pristine wilderness area, had been transformed into a moonscape of shell craters and shattered trees. Unexploded ordnance would continue to kill civilians for decades after the war ended, and vast areas remained uninhabitable due to chemical contamination from poison gas attacks. The ecological scars of the Meuse-Argonne offensive served as a permanent reminder of the war's destructive power. In the days following the Armistice, as American forces began the complex process of demobilization, the true strategic significance of the Meuse-Argonne offensive became apparent to military historians and political leaders alike. The campaign had not merely contributed to Germany's defeat, it had fundamentally altered the balance of power that would shape the 20th century. The United States had entered the war as a distant supporter of the Allied cause. It emerged as the decisive factor in Germany's collapse and a dominant voice in shaping the post-war world order. The immediate aftermath of the offensive revealed both the scale of American military achievement and the terrible human cost of that success. Casualty clearing stations that had operated around the clock for 7 weeks now faced the grim task of processing the wounded and dying, while the rest of the world celebrated peace. Hospital trains continued to carry broken soldiers back to base hospitals long after the fighting had ended, a somber reminder that victory's price was measured in more than territorial gains or strategic objectives achieved. The German military's assessment of American performance during the offensive provided perhaps the most objective evaluation of what had been accomplished. German staff officers, in post-war interviews and memoirs, expressed surprise at the rapid evolution of American tactical capabilities. Units that had been easily contained in September had become formidable opponents by November, displaying a flexibility and aggressiveness that German forces had not encountered from other Allied armies. This transformation from raw recruits to effective combat forces in less than 2 months represented a remarkable achievement in military training and adaptation. The logistical achievement of the Meuse-Argonne offensive was as impressive as its tactical success. Supplying over 1 million men in continuous combat for 47 days required innovations in transportation, communication, and medical support that would influence American military doctrine for generations. The Red Ball Express supply system developed during the campaign became the model for similar operations in World War II. The coordination of artillery support, involving thousands of guns firing millions of shells, established precedents for the combined arms operations that would characterize modern warfare. The strategic consequences of the offensive extended far beyond its immediate military objectives. The capture of the Sedan railway hub, while achieved only symbolically on November 11th, demonstrated American capability to conduct war-winning operations independently of Allied support. This military competence translated directly into political influence at the Paris Peace Conference, where President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points provided the framework for post-war settlement. Without the battlefield success of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, American diplomatic objectives would have carried far less weight in negotiations with European allies. The human legacy of the offensive was preserved in the establishment of military cemeteries throughout the former battle zone. The Meuse Argonne American Cemetery became the largest American military cemetery in Europe, its 14,000 graves serving as a permanent monument to the price of victory. The cemetery's dedication in 1927 brought together veterans of the offensive, many of whom had not seen each other since the Armistice. Their reunions provided the first comprehensive understanding of what individual units had experienced during the campaign, filling in gaps in the official historical record. The lessons learned during the Meuse-Argonne offensive profoundly influenced American military doctrine and organization between the wars. The importance of combined arms coordination, the necessity of adequate training before committing forces to combat, and the critical role of logistics in sustained offensive operations became fundamental principles of American military planning. When the United States entered World War II, many of the tactical innovations developed in the Argonne Forest were refined and applied on a global scale. The environmental and social consequences of the offensive continued long after the participants had returned home or been laid to rest. The heavily contested areas of the Argonne Forest remained scarred by unexploded ordnance and chemical contamination for decades. French farmers would continue to discover artillery shells and poison gas canisters well into the 21st century. The iron harvest of unexploded munitions served as a perpetual reminder of the offensive's intensity and the destructive power of modern warfare. Perhaps most significantly, the Meuse-Argonne offensive established the United States as a global military power capable of projecting force across oceans and conducting large-scale offensive operations against first-rate opponents. The confidence gained from this achievement would influence American foreign policy throughout the 20th century, establishing patterns of military intervention and international leadership that would define America's role in world affairs. The 47 days of fighting in the forests of eastern France had transformed not only the immediate strategic situation, but the fundamental balance of global power for generations to come.